The moment Captain Hayes saw the cleaning woman standing inside the classified briefing room, pointer in hand, calmly correcting the submarine coordinates projected on the secure display, he knew two things instantly. First, that his career was about to end in spectacular fashion, and second, that whoever she really was, she wasn't there to empty the trash. 12 hours earlier, none of it had registered as unusual. The Naval Command Center at Pearl Harbor hummed with its usual controlled chaos, boots on polished floors, radio chatter bleeding through doorways, the salt-heavy air pressing in through ventilation systems that never quite kept up with the Hawaiian heat. Senior officers moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their minds occupied with fleet movements, readiness reports, and the thousand small decisions that kept the Pacific Command operational. And like every other Tuesday morning, the cleaning staff arrived early, moving through the building with the kind of invisibility that comes from being part of the background, expected but unnoticed, essential but unremarked upon. The woman pushing the yellow cart down the third-floor corridor fit that role perfectly. Late 20s, blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, dressed in plain navy work pants and a maintenance polo that had seen better days. Her movements were efficient, unhurried, methodical as she emptied bins, wiped down surfaces, and restocked supplies in the small kitchenette outside the operations center. Nobody looked twice. Captain Richard Hayes passed her without acknowledgement, his attention fixed on the tablet in his hand, reviewing the morning brief he'd be delivering to Admiral Strickland in less than 20 minutes. Submarine deployments, patrol routes, maintenance schedules, all routine, all controlled, all perfectly within his area of expertise. Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Vera Chen followed, heels clicking sharply against the tile. "Sir, the Admiral's already asking for updates on the Hawaii rotation," she said, her voice tight with the kind of stress that came from working directly under Strickland's unforgiving standards. "Tell him we're on schedule," Hayes replied without looking up. "The coordinates are locked, the patrol windows are optimized, everything's been triple-checked." Chen nodded, but her expression suggested she'd heard that confidence before, usually right before something went sideways. They entered the briefing room, a secure space with reinforced walls, encrypted displays, and access restricted to personnel with clearances most sailors would never see. The large screen at the front showed a tactical map of the Pacific, blue icons marking submarine positions, red zones indicating restricted waters, patrol routes traced in precise geometric patterns. Hayes set his tablet down, glancing at the wall clock. 15 minutes until the Admiral arrived. Plenty of time to run through the presentation one more time, make sure every detail was airtight, every number defensible. "Coffee?" Chen asked, already heading toward the door. "Black," Hayes said absently, his eyes scanning the coordinates displayed on the screen. She disappeared into the hallway, and for a moment, Hayes was alone with the map, with the weight of responsibility that came with coordinating nuclear submarine movements across half the Pacific Ocean. It was the kind of work that demanded absolute precision, zero margin for error, the kind that ended careers if you got it wrong. He leaned forward, studying the patrol route for SSN 774, the USS Virginia, currently positioned northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. The numbers looked right: latitude, longitude, depth parameters, all within acceptable ranges. But something nagged at him. He pulled up the raw data, cross-referencing it against the navigation charts, and that's when he saw it, a slight discrepancy, barely noticeable. A decimal point that had shifted during data entry, altering the coordinates by a fraction that would translate to nearly 15 nautical miles of actual drift. Not catastrophic, not yet, but enough to push the submarine's patrol route dangerously close to a restricted zone, close enough that if the timing was wrong, if another vessel was in the area, if any one of a dozen variables shifted, "Sir." Chen's voice cut through his thoughts as she returned with 2 cups of coffee. Hayes straightened, his jaw tightening. "We've got a problem." Before she could respond, the door opened again and Admiral Strickland entered, his presence filling the room immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases, his expression carved from the kind of granite that didn't tolerate mistakes. "Captain," he said, his voice clipped and expectant. "Let's see what you've got." Hayes felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing through options, through explanations, through the calculus of admitting the error now versus hoping it wouldn't matter, hoping nobody else would catch it. He stepped toward the display, opening his mouth to begin, and that's when the door opened one more time. The cleaning woman stepped inside, her yellow cart left in the hallway, a tablet in her hand that definitely didn't come from the maintenance department. Her eyes swept the room once, clinical and assessing, before settling on the screen. "Excuse me," Strickland barked, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a classified briefing. You need to leave immediately." She didn't move. Instead, she looked at Hayes, then at the coordinates on the display, and her expression shifted, something almost like disappointment crossing her features. "Those numbers are wrong," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm authority that didn't match her uniform at all. And in that moment, everything stopped. The silence that followed her statement felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Admiral Strickland's face flushed dark red, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Security," he snapped, reaching for the phone on the conference table. "Now." But the woman didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't show even a flicker of the fear that should have been there. Instead, she stepped forward calmly, setting her tablet on the table with deliberate precision. "Admiral, before you make that call," she said, her voice still level, still controlled, "you should look at grid reference November 7-4. The coordinates Captain Hayes is about to brief have SSN 774 drifting into a sonar surveillance zone that's been active since 0300 this morning." Hayes felt his blood run cold. He looked at the screen again, his eyes finding the exact grid she'd referenced. And there it was, the overlap he'd been starting to identify himself, now laid bare by someone who had no business knowing any of this. Chen had frozen mid-step, coffee cup still in her hand, staring at the woman like she'd just spoken in a dead language. Strickland's hand hovered over the phone. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The woman reached into her pocket slowly, deliberately, and produced a military ID. Not the building access badge the cleaning staff carried, but something else entirely dark blue, with markings that made Strickland's expression shift from anger to confusion to something approaching recognition. He took it from her, studied it for 3 long seconds, and his entire posture changed. "Commander," he said quietly, the title landing like a thunderclap in the small room. Hayes' stomach dropped. "Commander, not cleaning staff, not civilian contractor. Commander." The woman commander nodded once. "Commander Maya Archer, Naval Intelligence. I've been embedded here for the past 6 weeks conducting a security audit." Her eyes moved to Hayes, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. "And what I just watched was a near miss that would have put a billion-dollar submarine and 134 sailors directly into a foreign surveillance net." Hayes opened his mouth, but no words came out. The error he'd barely begun to identify, the one he'd been seconds away from presenting to the Admiral as verified and accurate, was now exposed completely. "The coordinates are off by 0.02 degrees, Archer continued, stepping to the display and pulling up a secondary navigation chart that materialized with credentials Hayes didn't have access to. "Data entry error, probably during the overnight update cycle. Small enough to slip past automated checks, large enough to matter." She traced the route with one finger, showing exactly where the submarine's actual path would take it versus where it was supposed to be. The gap between them crossed directly through a red-shaded zone marked with classification headers Hayes recognized but couldn't read. "If SSN 774 continues on this heading," Archer said, "she'll be fully visible to underwater monitoring stations operated by a foreign power. Every movement, every depth change, every tactical signature recorded and analyzed." Strickland had gone very still, his earlier anger replaced by something colder, more calculating. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "I identified the discrepancy 40 minutes ago during routine surveillance of data preparation procedures," Archer replied. "I wanted to see how the error would be caught and corrected through normal channels." She paused, her gaze steady. It wasn't. Hayes felt the floor drop out from under him. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a test, and he'd failed it. Captain Hayes, Strickland said, his voice dangerously quiet, would you have caught this before transmitting the orders? Hayes forced himself to meet the Admiral's eyes. I was in the process of reviewing when you arrived, sir. I had identified an anomaly. That's not what I asked. The truth sat heavy in Hayes's chest. Unclear, sir. Strickland's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, acknowledging the honesty if not accepting the failure. Then he turned back to Archer. Commander, I assume you have the corrected coordinates. Yes, sir. She pulled up a second display, showing the amended route clean, precise, well clear of the surveillance zone. I've also identified 3 additional minor discrepancies in the overnight updates that should be reviewed before any orders are transmitted. She listed them efficiently, each one a small error that individually meant little but collectively represented a pattern of sloppiness that could have cascaded into something far worse. Chen had finally set down her coffee, her face pale as she watched the systematic dismantling of the brief she'd helped prepare. When Archer finished, Strickland exhaled slowly. Captain Hayes, Commander Chen, you're both dismissed. I want a full review of data verification protocols on my desk by 1600, and I want every coordinate checked personally before anything leaves this building. Yes, sir, they said in unison, the words barely audible. As they moved toward the door, Strickland's voice stopped them. Captain, Hayes turned. You're not being relieved, Strickland said, but you're on notice. Clear, clear, sir. They left, the door closing behind them with a soft click that felt far too final. Inside the briefing room, Strickland studied Archer for a long moment. 6 weeks undercover, he said finally. What else did you find? Archer's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested the answer was longer than either of them wanted. Enough to recommend immediate changes, sir, she said. And enough to know that if I hadn't been here today, you would have transmitted those orders. Strickland nodded slowly, the weight of that reality settling over him. Then I think, he said quietly, we need to have a much longer conversation. The conference room cleared of everyone except Strickland, and Archer felt different now, no longer a space for performance or hierarchy, but for truth. The Admiral gestured to a chair, and for the first time Archer sat, though her posture remained controlled, alert. 6 weeks, Strickland repeated, leaning against the table. You've been emptying trash cans and watching my entire command operate while nobody knew who you were. That was the point, sir, Archer said. People behave differently when they think they're being evaluated. I needed to see the actual procedures, not the ones performed for inspections. Strickland's expression was unreadable. And Archer pulled up a document on her tablet, but she didn't read from it. She'd clearly memorized every detail. Data verification protocols are being rushed during shift changes. Junior personnel are approving coordinates they don't fully understand because they trust the automated systems. Senior officers are spread too thin to catch errors that should never make it past initial review. She paused, letting that sink in. This morning wasn't an anomaly, sir. It was inevitable. The words landed hard, but Strickland didn't flinch. Recommendations. Immediate implementation of dual verification for all submarine coordinates. Mandatory cross-check procedures before any classified brief. And a rotating schedule that doesn't leave critical reviews to overnight shifts with minimal supervision. Strickland nodded slowly. That'll slow things down. Yes, sir. It'll also stop us from accidentally giving foreign intelligence a real-time tracking map of our submarine fleet. A long silence followed. Then Strickland's expression softened slightly, not quite a smile but something close to respect. You could have stopped this earlier, could have revealed yourself, pulled rank, fixed it quietly. I could have, Archer agreed, but then you wouldn't know how it happened, and it would happen again. Strickland exhaled, the sound carrying weeks of tension. Captain Hayes is a good officer. I know, Archer said. That's what makes this dangerous. Good officers making small mistakes under systemic pressure. Nobody being malicious, nobody being negligent, just everyone being human in a system that doesn't have room for it. She closed her tablet. The audit report will reflect that this isn't a personnel failure, it's a structural one. Strickland studied her for a moment. How long have you been doing this, the undercover work? 3 years, Archer said. 5 installations, same methodology. I've been a janitor, a cafeteria worker, a maintenance tech. People talk around you when they think you don't matter. They make mistakes when they think nobody's watching. And you catch them. Before they become disasters, yes, sir. Strickland shook his head slowly, something like admiration crossing his features. I've read your file, Commander. You could be running your own command by now. Why this? Archer was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Because I was on a submarine once when bad coordinates almost put us into a conflict zone. The error was caught, but barely. And I realized that the most dangerous threats aren't always the ones we're watching for. They're the ones we create ourselves through assumptions and fatigue. She looked back at him. So I made it my job to find them first. Strickland nodded, understanding settling over his features. Your report will have my full support. Whatever changes you recommend, we'll implement them. Thank you, sir. He straightened, his command presence returning. But I want you to deliver the brief to Captain Hayes and Commander Chen personally. They need to understand this wasn't about embarrassing them, it was about saving them. Archer stood as well. Understood. 2 hours later, in a smaller conference room with better coffee and significantly less tension, Archer walked Hayes and Chen through everything she'd found not as a rebuke, but as a teaching moment. She showed them the patterns, the subtle ways errors crept in, the systemic pressures that made even good officers cut corners they didn't realize they were cutting. Hayes listened without defensiveness, his earlier shame giving way to something more productive determination. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? He asked. Archer pulled up the new protocols she designed. You build in redundancy, you slow down the parts that matter, and you create a culture where catching mistakes isn't seen as failure, it's seen as the job. Chen leaned forward, studying the procedures. This is going to require more personnel hours. Yes, Archer said, but fewer than a congressional inquiry after a submarine incident. Hayes nodded slowly, then looked at Archer with genuine curiosity. Why didn't you just tell us who you were from the start? Because then you would have shown me what you wanted me to see, Archer said simply. Not what actually happens. She stood, gathering her materials. You're both good officers. You care about getting it right. That's exactly why this system needed fixing, because even people who care make mistakes when the structure fails them. As she moved toward the door, Hayes spoke again. Commander, she turned. Thank you, he said, for catching it, and for not just ending my career. Archer's expression softened slightly. The goal isn't to end careers, Captain. It's to save lives. She left them there, stepping back into the corridor where her yellow cleaning cart still waited, now feeling like the most effective piece of intelligence equipment in the entire building. 3 months later, the new protocols were in place across the Pacific Fleet. Error rates dropped by 70%. Submarine deployments ran smoother, safer, with layers of verification that caught problems before they became crises. And somewhere in the administrative building at Pearl Harbor, a blonde woman in maintenance clothing pushed a cart down another corridor, watching, listening, waiting for the next invisible problem that nobody else would see until it was too late. Because the best defense, she'd learned long ago, wasn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it was the one nobody noticed at all.